The transport ship broke through the atmosphere of Station Prime, and Katie Rodriguez pressed her face against the small window to watch the massive structure grow larger with each passing second. She had traveled for 3 weeks across space to reach the Galactic Academy, and her small bag contained everything she owned, and her heart beat fast with excitement and fear mixed together in equal parts. The station was huge beyond anything she had imagined, and it looked like someone had taken 1,000 cities and stacked them on top of each other and wrapped the whole thing in gleaming metal and glass. Other passengers sat around her, and they came from worlds she had only read about in books. There was a being made entirely of crystal who hummed softly to himself, and another creature with too many arms who kept rearranging her luggage over and over. Katie felt very small and very human among all these strange and wonderful aliens. She wore simple clothes compared to their elaborate outfits, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried only one bag while others had floating trunks and hovering cases that followed them like loyal pets. The ship docked with a gentle thump and the doors hissed open, and Katie stepped out into the station for the first time. The air smelled different here, and it had a metallic tang mixed with something sweet like flowers she could not name. The corridor stretched ahead of her, and walls curved up and away in directions that hurt her eyes to follow. Aliens of every size and shape moved through the space, and some walked and some floated, and some seemed to teleport short distances when she was not looking directly at them. Katie followed the signs toward the student housing section, and her translator implant worked hard to convert all the different languages into words she could understand. She passed shops selling food that glowed and stores offering technology she could not begin to comprehend. A group of students rushed past her, and they were laughing about something and speaking in musical tones that her implant could not quite translate properly. She felt a wave of loneliness wash over her, but she pushed it away and kept walking. The housing section was quieter, and the corridors here had softer lighting and plants growing along the walls. Katie found her assigned room and pressed her hand against the scanner, and the door opened to reveal a small space with a bed and desk and window that looked out at the stars. She set her bag down and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the weight of how far from home she really was. Earth seemed impossibly distant now, and everyone she knew and loved was on a planet she could not even see from this window. A chime sounded and her door opened without warning, and a tall, elegant figure stepped inside. She was unlike anything Katie had ever seen, and her skin was pale like moonlight, and her ears came to sharp points, and her eyes were the color of deep forests. 2 small dragons perched on her shoulders, and their scales shimmered purple and silver, and they watched Katie with bright, intelligent eyes. The woman smiled and said, "I am Lyrina, and I believe we are neighbors, and I wanted to introduce myself before classes begin tomorrow." Katie stood up quickly and tried to smooth her wrinkled shirt and said, "I am Katie Rodriguez, and it is nice to meet you," and she could not stop staring at the dragons. Lyrina noticed her gaze and laughed, and it was a sound like bells ringing, and she said, "These are Shimmer and Frost, and they are curious about you, and they do not usually take interest in new people so quickly." The dragon called Shimmer spread her wings and glided across the room to land on Katie's desk and tilted her head to study the human girl with one bright eye. Katie reached out slowly and asked, "Is it okay if I touch her?" And Lyrina nodded and said if she did not want you to touch her, she would have stayed on my shoulder. Katie gently ran her finger along Shimmer's scales, and they felt warm and smooth like polished stone, and the dragon made a pleased chirping sound. Frost flew over to join his sister, and soon both dragons were investigating Katie's belongings and sniffing at her bag and making soft noises to each other. Lyrina sat on the edge of Katie's bed without asking and said, "You are human, yes," and Katie nodded and said, "I am the only human at the academy, as far as I know, and I applied 3 times before they accepted me." Lyrina studied her with those deep forest eyes and said, "Humans have quite a reputation, and there are stories about your kind that seem impossible, and yet people swear they are true." Katie felt her cheeks grow warm and asked, "What kind of stories?" And Lyrina smiled and said, "Stories about humans doing things that should not be possible and solving problems that stump entire civilizations and surviving situations that would kill any other species." Katie laughed and said, "I think those stories are exaggerated, and I am just a girl who wanted to learn and who asked too many questions back home." Lyrina stood and called her dragons back to her shoulders and said, "We shall see tomorrow, and the academy has a way of revealing what people are truly capable of." And she walked toward the door and paused, and added, "If you need anything, I'm in the room next to yours, and my dragons seem to like you, which means I will probably see you often, whether you want to or not." After Lorena left, Katie unpacked her few belongings and arranged them carefully in the small room. She placed a photo of her family on the desk and looked at their smiling faces and felt that loneliness creep back in. Her little brother had cried when she left, and her mother had hugged her so tight, Katie thought her ribs might crack, and her father had just looked proud and sad at the same time. They believed in her even when she did not believe in herself, and that thought made her determined to succeed here, no matter how hard it became. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. The academy was known across the galaxy as the best school for science and mathematics and philosophy and 100 other subjects. Students came from every corner of known space to learn here, and only the brightest minds were accepted. Katie had scored impossibly high on the entrance exams, and the academy had been shocked that a human from a backwater planet could compete with species that had been studying advanced sciences for thousands of years. Sleep did not come easily, and Katie tossed and turned and finally gave up and went to the window. The stars stretched out before her in endless patterns, and she tried to find Earth among all those lights but could not. Somewhere out there was her home and her family and everything familiar. Here she was alone in a strange place surrounded by aliens who probably thought humans were primitive. But she had not come all this way to give up before she even started, and tomorrow she would show them what a human could do. She finally fell asleep as the station's artificial day cycle began to dim the lights, and she dreamed of impossible puzzles and dragons, with scales like starlight and a future that seemed both terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Katie woke to a gentle chiming sound, and it took her a moment to remember where she was. The room was still dim, and the artificial morning had not yet begun. She sat up and rubbed her eyes and checked the time display on the wall, and it showed she had 2 hours before the opening ceremony. Her stomach felt tight with nervousness, and she got up and went through her morning routine and tried to calm herself by focusing on simple tasks like brushing her teeth and choosing what to wear. She picked her best outfit, which was still plain, compared to what she had seen other students wearing yesterday. A simple blue shirt and dark pants and comfortable shoes that had carried her through many long days back on Earth. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw a girl who looked young and uncertain, and she wished she could see the confidence that others seemed to have naturally. But she was here, and that counted for something, and she would face whatever came next with all the courage she could gather. A knock on her door made her jump, and she opened it to find Lorena standing there with her 2 dragons already perched on her shoulders. Lorena wore robes that seemed to shift colors in the light, and her long silver hair was braided with small crystals that caught and reflected every bit of light. She smiled at Katie and said, "Good morning, neighbor, and I thought perhaps you would like company walking to the Grand Hall, and it can be overwhelming to navigate the station alone on your first day." Katie felt grateful and relieved and said, "I would really appreciate that, and thank you for thinking of me." They walked together through the corridors, and Lorena pointed out important locations along the way. The medical center where species from 1,000 worlds could receive treatment, and the library that contained knowledge from civilizations older than human recorded history, and the dining halls that served food compatible with hundreds of different biological systems. Katie tried to memorize everything, but it was too much, and her head spun with all the new information. Other students joined them as they walked, and Lorena introduced Katie to some of them. There was a tall being named Vorak, who had blue skin and gills on his neck, and he studied quantum mechanics. A small furry creature called Pip, who specialized in xenobiology and spoke in quick, excited bursts that Katie's translator struggled to keep up with. A floating sphere of light named Essence, who communicated through color changes and apparently was working on understanding consciousness itself. They all greeted Katie politely, but she could see the curiosity in their eyes and the unspoken question of what a human was doing here. The Grand Hall was enormous, and it made Katie feel like an insect standing at the base of a mountain. The ceiling stretched up so high she could not see the top, and the walls curved away in impossible angles, and the whole space seemed to shift and change when she was not looking directly at it. Thousands of seats filled the hall, and they were arranged in sections based on what species needed what kind of environment. Some seats were filled with water for aquatic beings, and some generated their own gravity fields, and some flickered in and out of normal space for creatures that existed partially in other dimensions. Lyrina led Katie to a section where the seating was normal by human standards, and they sat together in the back row. The dragon settled on the armrests between them and watched the hall fill with students. Katie had never seen so many different species in one place, and it was beautiful and overwhelming and slightly terrifying all at once. Beings of pure energy floated near the ceiling, and massive creatures that looked like living stone took up entire sections, and tiny beings no bigger than her thumb clustered together in special seats designed for their size. A hush fell over the crowd, and a figure appeared at the front of the hall. Professor Zelthar was tall and thin, and his skin was deep blue and covered in patterns that seemed to move on their own. He had 6 eyes arranged in 2 rows across his face, and they blinked in sequence as he looked out at the assembled students. His voice when he spoke filled the entire hall without need for amplification, and it carried a weight that made everyone listen. "Welcome, young minds, to the Galactic Academy," said Professor Zelthar, and his skin patterns rippled with what might have been pride or pleasure. "You have come from across known space to study here, and you represent the brightest and most promising individuals your worlds have to offer. Over the next cycles you will be challenged in ways you cannot yet imagine, and you will learn things that will change how you see the universe itself, and some of you will fail, because that is the nature of growth, and some of you will succeed beyond your wildest dreams." Katie listened and felt her nervousness transform into determination. She had not come all this way to fail, and she would work harder than anyone else if that was what it took. Shimmer the dragon seemed to sense her thoughts, and made a soft chirping sound, and nuzzled against her arm. Katie smiled and scratched behind the dragon's ears and felt some of her tension ease away. Professor Zelthar continued speaking, and he talked about the history of the academy and the great minds who had studied here before, and the discoveries that had been made within these walls. He spoke of responsibility and the duty that came with knowledge, and the importance of using what they learned for the betterment of all species. Katie found herself nodding along and feeling inspired by his words, and believing that maybe she really did belong here after all. Then Professor Zelthar said, "And now I will present to you a tradition we have maintained for 3,000 years, and every new class of students is shown the eternal puzzle, as a reminder of the limits of knowledge and the importance of humility." He gestured, and a massive crystalline board appeared in the air before him, and it was filled with floating symbols that twisted and rotated and changed as they moved. The symbols were beautiful in a strange alien way, and they seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and Katie found herself leaning forward to see them better. "This puzzle," said Professor Zelthar, "has stumped the greatest minds in the galaxy, and no species has ever solved it in under 10 cycles, and most never solve it at all. It requires understanding 17 different branches of science simultaneously, and processing information faster than most organic minds can manage." The symbols danced faster now and created patterns that seemed to fold space itself, and Katie watched them move and felt something click in her mind like a door opening. The puzzle was complex, yes, but underneath all that complexity, she could see the simple patterns that held it together. It reminded her of something, and she thought back to lazy afternoons with her little brother, and the puzzles they would solve together, and how he taught her that every hard problem was just a bunch of easy problems stacked on top of each other. You just had to find the right way to take them apart. Katie stared at the crystalline board, and her mind raced through possibilities, and she saw how each symbol connected to 3 others, and how those connections changed based on observer position, and temperature, and even the number of people watching. She saw the quantum probability matrices woven through the mathematical sequences and the linguistic patterns from dead languages, providing the key to unlock it all. She saw it all at once in a moment of perfect clarity, and the answer was so obvious she almost laughed. Lyrina noticed Katie leaning forward with intense focus and whispered, "Are you all right?" And Katie nodded slowly and said, "I think I see it, and I think I know how to solve it." Lyrina looked at her with surprise and said, "That is impossible. And no one has ever solved this puzzle so quickly." And Katie smiled and said, "Maybe no one looked at it the right way before, and maybe being human means seeing things differently." Professor Zelthar was still speaking and explaining the complexity of the puzzle and the centuries of work that had gone into creating it, and Katie took a deep breath and decided that if she was going to make an impression on her first day, she might as well make it a memorable one. "Already done," said Katie, and her voice was quiet. but it carried through the hall because everyone had been listening to the professor in complete silence. Every head turned toward her and thousands of eyes from hundreds of species focused on the human girl in the back row. Katie felt her heart hammering in her chest, but she stood up anyway, and her legs felt shaky, but she kept her voice steady when she spoke. Professor Zelthar stopped speaking mid-sentence, and all 6 of his eyes blinked in sequence, and his skin changed from deep blue to a confused orange color. He stared at Katie for a long moment, and the entire hall waited in silence, and finally he said, "What did you say, child?" And his voice carried disbelief mixed with something that might have been concern or maybe curiosity. Katie swallowed hard and said, "I solved it. And the answer is 73.2 repeating," and she pointed at a specific cluster of symbols in the floating puzzle and continued saying, "If you rotate that section counterclockwise and flip the quantum state of these 3 markers here, and then apply the Fibonacci sequence backwards through the linguistic matrix, it all collapses into a single solution, and the math works out to 73.2 repeating." The silence in the hall became even deeper if that was possible, and Katie could hear her own breathing and the soft sound of Shimmer and Frost shifting on their perch beside Lorena. Students whispered to each other in 100 different languages, and the translator implants struggled to keep up with all the shocked conversations happening at once. Lorena looked at Katie with wide eyes and whispered, "How did you do that?" And Katie just shrugged because she was not entirely sure herself. Professor Zelthar moved to a control panel at the base of the crystalline board, and his many fingers danced over the surface with practiced movements. He input the solution that Katie had described, and his skin continued to shift colors rapidly between orange and purple and green as he worked. The symbols in the puzzle began to move and shift and fold, and the entire assembly watched as the impossible puzzle started to unravel layer by layer. Katie watched too, and she felt a strange mixture of pride and fear churning in her stomach. What if she was wrong, and what if she had just embarrassed herself in front of the entire academy on her very first day? And what if they decided a human who thought she could solve impossible puzzles was too arrogant to teach? But the symbols kept moving and collapsing, and she could see the pattern resolving exactly as she had predicted it would. The crystalline board flashed bright white, and the light was so intense that some students had to shield their eyes or dim their vision. Then it displayed a single number floating in the air for everyone to see, and the number read 73.2 repeating, and the hall erupted in shocked sounds. Whistles and clicks and musical tones and grinding noises and sounds Katie had never heard before and could not begin to name, all expressing the same amazement and disbelief. "But that is impossible," stuttered Professor Zelthar, and his skin was now cycling through colors so fast it hurt to look at him directly. He turned away from the control panel and stared at Katie and said, "How did you do this? And how did you see the pattern? And no one has ever solved this puzzle in less than 10 cycles. And you did it in moments while I was still explaining the rules, and I do not understand how this is possible." Katie walked down the steps toward the front of the hall, and every eye followed her movement, and she felt very exposed and very small, but she kept walking anyway. She reached the crystalline board and looked up at the symbols that were now settling into their solved state, and she said, "It reminded me of a puzzle my little brother does. And back on Earth we have these things called Rubik's Cubes, and they look impossible at first, but once you understand that every complex system is just simple patterns stacked together, it becomes easier." She continued, and her voice grew stronger as she explained and said, "You just have to find the right angle to look from and the right way to break the problem down into smaller pieces, and then solve each piece one at a time. And when I looked at your puzzle, I saw that all these complicated symbols and matrices and sequences were really just telling me the same basic information over and over, in different ways. And once I saw that, the solution became obvious." A student near the front who looked like a collection of floating geometric shapes spoke up, and his voice came through as a series of tones, and the translator rendered it as, "But how did you process all that information so quickly, and our best computational minds take cycles just to map the initial parameters, and you saw the whole thing at once?" Katie thought about how to explain it and finally said, "I did not really think about it, and I just looked and saw, and maybe human brains work differently than other species, and maybe we are good at seeing patterns because we evolved on a planet that was always trying to kill us, and pattern recognition meant survival." Lorena had come down to stand beside Katie, and her dragons flew ahead and landed on Katie's shoulders, and everyone in the hall gasped, because Lorena's dragons never went to strangers, and they were famously picky about who they allowed near them. Shimmer nuzzled against Katie's cheek and Frost made a pleased chirping sound, and Katie reached up to stroke their scales and felt comforted by their warm presence. Professor Zelthar slowly regained his composure, and his skin settled into a thoughtful, green color, and he looked at Katie with new eyes and with respect mixed with wariness. He said, "I have taught at this academy for 200 years, and I have seen students from every corner of known space, and I have watched brilliant minds struggle with challenges both great and small, and in all that time I have never seen anything quite like what you just did, young human." He turned to address the entire hall and said, "Let this be a lesson to all of you, and never assume you know the limits of what is possible, and never underestimate any species, no matter how young or primitive they may seem." He looked back at Katie and asked, "What is your name?" And Katie said, "I am Katie Rodriguez from Earth, and I am honored to be here, and I hope I did not cause any problems by solving your puzzle." Professor Zelthar made a sound that might have been a laugh and said, "Problems, no, child, and you have given us all something to think about, and you have reminded us that there are many ways to see the universe, and what seems impossible from one angle may be simple from another, and that is a valuable lesson, and perhaps the most important one we can teach here." He gestured toward the seats and said, "Please return to your places, and we have much more to discuss today. And I suspect young Katie Rodriguez will have many more surprises for us before her time here is done." Katie walked back to her seat with the dragon still on her shoulders, and she could feel everyone watching her, and some students moved aside to let her pass, and some reached out to touch her arm or shoulder as she went by, as if she was something special. Clarina walked beside her and whispered, "You have made quite an impression, and I suspect everyone in the galaxy will know your name by tomorrow." And Katie laughed nervously and said, "I just wanted to learn, and I did not mean to cause such a fuss." They sat back down, and the dragons returned to their position between them, and the ceremony continued, but Katie barely heard any of it. Her mind was racing with thoughts and emotions, and she kept replaying the moment when the puzzle solved itself, and wondering what she had just set in motion. She had wanted to prove that humans belonged at the academy, but now she worried she had proven too much too quickly, and painted a target on herself that she was not ready to handle. But it was done now, and there was no taking it back. And she would face whatever came next with the same determination that had brought her this far from home. The ceremony ended and students began filing out of the grand hall, and Katie stood up to leave but found herself immediately surrounded by curious aliens who all wanted to talk to her. They asked questions faster than her translator could process, and reached out to touch her as if she was some kind of rare specimen, and pressed close until she felt like she could not breathe. Panic started to rise in her chest, and she looked around desperately for an escape route, but there were too many bodies blocking her way. Larina stepped between Katie and the crowd, and her dragons spread their wings wide and hissed in a way that made everyone take a step back. Clarina said in a voice that commanded attention, "My friend needs space, and you will all have time to meet her later, but right now she needs to breathe and process what has happened, so please return to your own business." The crowd hesitated and then slowly dispersed, and Katie felt like she could breathe again, and she whispered, "Thank you," to Larina, who just smiled and said, "That is what friends do." They walked together through the corridors, and Larina led Katie away from the main student areas and toward a quieter section of the station. They passed through a door that opened onto a garden, and Katie stopped in surprise because she had not expected to find plants and trees and running water in the middle of a space station. The garden was beautiful and filled with species from 100 different worlds, and some plants glowed softly, and some hummed with barely audible vibrations, and some seemed to reach toward them as they walked past. Larina found a bench near a small fountain and sat down and gestured for Katie to join her. The dragons flew off to explore the garden and chased each other between the trees and made joyful sounds as they played. Katie sat down heavily and put her head in her hands and said, "I think I made a huge mistake and I should not have said anything. And now everyone thinks I'm some kind of genius and I am just going to disappoint them when they realize I am just a normal girl who got lucky." Larina was quiet for a moment and watched her dragons play and then said, "You did not get lucky, and you saw something that thousands of brilliant minds missed, and you solved a puzzle that has stumped entire civilizations for 3,000 years. And that is not luck, Katie, and that is something special." Katie looked up and said, "But what if I cannot do it again, and what if that was just a fluke, and what if I fail at everything else and prove that humans really do not belong here?" Lorena turned to face her, and those deep forest eyes were kind and understanding, and she said, I have lived for 800 years, and I have traveled to 50 galaxies, and I have met more beings than I could possibly count. And I have learned that self-doubt is universal, and every species questions themselves, and every individual wonders if they are good enough. She reached out and took Katie's hand and said, the fact that you doubt yourself means you are wise enough to know you still have things to learn, and that is more valuable than arrogance. Katie felt tears prickling at her eyes, and she blinked them back and said, on Earth I was always the weird kid who asked too many questions and who saw patterns in everything, and who could not just accept simple answers, and I thought coming here would be different. But now I am even more of an outsider, and at least back home everyone was human. Lorena squeezed her hand and said, being different is not a weakness, and it is your greatest strength, and the galaxy needs people who see things from new angles and who question what everyone else accepts. Shimmer and Frost returned from their exploration and landed on the bench between them, and both dragons nuzzled against Katie with obvious affection. Lorena laughed and said, my dragons are never wrong about people, and they bonded with you instantly, and that has only happened twice before, in all the centuries I have known them. Katie scratched behind Shimmer's ears and asked what happened to the other two people they bonded with, and Lorena smiled sadly and said, they both went on to do great things, and they both changed the galaxy in important ways, and they both died too young because greatness often comes with a price. That thought sobered Katie, and she looked at the dragons and wondered what they saw in her that she could not see in herself. Frost chirped softly and climbed into her lap and curled up like a cat, and his warm weight was comforting. She stroked his purple scales and asked Lorena, how did you end up with dragons, and are they common where you come from? Lorena shook her head and said, no, they are incredibly rare, and I found them as eggs abandoned on a dead world, and I raised them and bonded with them, and they have been my companions for 400 years. 400 years, said Katie, and tried to wrap her mind around that number, and you are 800 years old, and I cannot imagine living that long. Lorena laughed and said, time moves differently when you have so much of it, and sometimes I feel ancient, and sometimes I feel like I am still learning the basics of existence, and I suspect I will feel that way for another 800 years if I am lucky. Katie said humans only live about 80 years if we are fortunate, and Lorena looked at her with surprise and said, then you must live with such urgency, and every moment must feel precious, and maybe that is why you solve problems so quickly, because you do not have time to waste. They sat in comfortable silence for a while and watched the strange plants sway in the artificial breeze, and listened to the water flowing in the fountain. Katie felt her panic slowly fading and being replaced by a calm determination. She said, to Lorena, I want to learn everything I can while I am here, and I want to prove that humans can contribute something valuable to the galaxy, and I want to make my family proud even though they are impossibly far away. Lorena stood and offered her hand to help Katie up and said, then we should get started, and there is an entire galaxy worth of knowledge waiting for us, and I think you and I will make excellent study partners. Katie took her hand and stood and said, I would like that very much, and thank you for being kind to me when you did not have to be. Lorena smiled and called her dragons back to her shoulders and said, I told you we are friends now, and friends help each other, and besides, I have a feeling that knowing you is going to make my life much more interesting. They left the garden and headed toward the library, and along the way they passed groups of students who stopped talking when they saw Katie, and whispered behind their hands or appendages or whatever they used for communication. Katie tried to ignore the attention, but it was hard when everywhere she looked she saw beings staring at her with curiosity or suspicion, or sometimes what looked like fear. She wondered what they were thinking, and whether they saw her as a threat or an anomaly or just something strange. The library was even more impressive than the grand hall, and it stretched up and out in dimensions that seemed impossible, and shelves floated in midair, and books glowed with soft light, and information terminals hummed with processing power. Beings of all kinds moved through the space, and some studied alone, and some worked in groups, and some appeared to be having heated debates in languages Katie did not recognize. It smelled like old paper and new technology and something else she could not quite name. Lorena led her to a section marked for quantum mathematics, and pulled down several books that looked ancient and handed them to Katie and said, if you really want to understand how you solved that puzzle today, then you need to understand the underlying theory, and these are good places to start. Katie took the books, and they were heavier than she expected, and the covers were warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with faint energy. She opened the first one and saw symbols that her translator could not render, and equations that hurt her eyes to look at directly. Lorena saw her expression and laughed and said, "Do not worry, and I will help you, and we will start slow and build up your understanding piece by piece, and by the end of the term, you will be reading those symbols as easily as your native language." Katie hoped she was right, but she had doubts because this seemed far more complicated than anything she had studied on Earth, and she wondered again if she had made a terrible mistake coming here. But she pushed those doubts aside and opened the book and began to read, and Lorena sat beside her and explained the concepts in simple terms, and the dragons curled up on the table between them, and Katie felt something settle in her chest, and she realized that maybe she had found where she belonged, after all. The next few weeks passed in a blur of classes and studying and slowly learning to navigate life at the academy. Katie threw herself into her coursework with determination and discovered that while some subjects came easily to her, others were brutally difficult. Quantum mechanics made sense in a way she could not quite explain, and she found herself solving problems faster than most of her classmates. But xenobiology was a nightmare of memorizing thousands of different species and their unique biological requirements, and she struggled to keep all the information straight in her head. Lorena became her constant companion and study partner, and the elf woman had a patience that seemed endless, and a way of explaining complex concepts that made them click in Katie's mind. They spent long hours in the library or in the garden, and Shimmer and Frost were always with them, and the dragons seemed to enjoy listening to their discussions, even if they could not understand the words. Other students began joining their study sessions, and slowly Katie found herself at the center of a small group of friends from different worlds. There was Vorak, the blue-skinned aquatic being who had gills on his neck and who needed to keep his skin moist at all times, and he carried a small device that sprayed water vapor around him constantly. He was brilliant at mathematics and had a dry sense of humor that took Katie several days to recognize as humor at all. There was Pip, the small furry creature who never stopped moving, and who spoke so fast the translators could barely keep up, and who knew more about biology than anyone else Katie had ever met. There was Essence, the floating sphere of light, who communicated through color changes and who was studying consciousness and the nature of existence itself, and whose ideas were so abstract that Katie often got headaches trying to follow them. And there was Crix, a being made of living crystal, who hummed constantly in harmonics that most species could not hear, but that Katie found strangely soothing, and who approached every problem with methodical precision that Katie admired, even when it drove her crazy with impatience. Together they formed an unlikely group, and they challenged each other and supported each other, and slowly Katie began to feel less like an outsider and more like she belonged. But not everyone was welcoming, and there were students who resented the attention Katie received and who whispered that she had only gotten lucky with the puzzle, and who waited eagerly for her to fail so they could prove humans were not special after all. The worst of them was a being named Zareth, who came from a species that prided themselves on intellectual superiority, and who had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years through knowledge and strategy. Zareth was tall and elegant, with silver skin and eyes like black holes and a voice that dripped with condescension whenever he spoke to Katie. He made it clear he thought humans were primitive and that Katie solving the puzzle was nothing more than random chance. Katie tried to ignore him, but Zareth seemed determined to prove her inferior, and he challenged her constantly in classes and questioned her answers and made subtle remarks designed to undermine her confidence. Professor Zelthar noticed the tension, and one day after class he announced that there would be a competition in 3 weeks, and students would work in teams to solve a series of progressively harder problems, and the winning team would receive access to restricted areas of the library and advanced research opportunities. Zareth immediately formed a team with the most brilliant students from the most advanced species, and he made a point of saying loudly that he looked forward to showing everyone what real intelligence looked like. Katie felt anger rise in her chest, but Lorena put a calming hand on her shoulder and said, "Let him talk and we will let our results speak for themselves." Their group of friends decided to form a team together, and they spent every free moment preparing and studying and practicing. The night before the competition, Katie could not sleep, and she lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the ways she could fail and embarrass herself and prove everyone right who said humans did not belong. Shimmer and Frost had taken to sleeping in her room, and they sensed her distress and climbed onto her bed and curled up against her, and their warm presence helped calm her racing thoughts. She whispered to them, "I am scared, and what if I let everyone down?" And they made soft, comforting sounds, and eventually she fell into restless sleep. The competition was held in the grand hall, and hundreds of students attended to watch, and the energy in the room was electric with anticipation. Teams gathered at stations spread across the floor, and each station had a holographic display showing the problems they would need to solve. Professor Zelthar stood at the front and explained the rules and said the problems would test everything they had learned so far and require creativity and cooperation and the ability to think under pressure. The competition began, and immediately, Katie and her team dove into the first problem, and it involved calculating the optimal trajectory for a ship traveling through a region of unstable space where normal physics did not apply. Katie saw the pattern almost immediately and started explaining her reasoning to the others, and together they worked through the calculations and verified the answer from multiple angles. They finished first and moved on to the next problem, while other teams were still working on the initial setup. Problem after problem they solved, and Katie found herself falling into a rhythm with her teammates, and each person contributed their unique perspective and strengths. Vorak handled the quantum calculations with ease, and Pip identified biological factors that affected the outcomes, and Essence provided insights into how consciousness affected quantum states, and Crix kept them organized and on track with methodical precision. Larina coordinated everything and made sure they did not miss important details, and the dragons watched from the sidelines and chirped encouragement. Hours passed, and teams began dropping out as the problems became impossibly difficult, and eventually, only 3 teams remained, and Katie's team and Zareth's team, and one other group from a species known for their computational abilities. The final problem appeared on the displays, and Katie read it and felt her heart sink because it was exactly the kind of problem she was worst at, and it required extensive knowledge of xenobiology and cultural analysis and historical context, and all the things she had struggled with since arriving. Zareth smiled coldly when he saw her expression, and his team began working confidently, and Katie looked at her own team and saw worry on their faces. But then Pip spoke up and said, "I know this, and my specialty is xenobiology, remember, and Vorak added, and I studied the history of these species last term, and Essence said the cultural components relate to my consciousness research, and Katie realized that what she could not do alone, her team could do together. She coordinated their efforts and asked the right questions and helped them see connections between their different areas of knowledge, and slowly the solution began to take shape. They worked frantically and verified every step and double-checked their reasoning and finally submitted their answer just seconds before the time limit expired. The hall went silent as Professor Zelthar reviewed the submissions, and his skin cycled through colors that suggested deep concentration. Finally he spoke and said, "We have a winner," and his voice filled the hall, and Katie held her breath and felt Larina's hand squeeze hers and heard the dragons chirping nervously. Professor Zelthar said the team led by Katie Rodriguez has submitted a complete and correct solution to all problems, including the final challenge, which I honestly did not expect anyone to solve, and they have done so with remarkable speed and accuracy. And they have demonstrated exactly what we hope to teach here, which is that diverse perspectives working together can achieve what no single mind can accomplish alone. The hall erupted in cheers and applause and sounds of approval from 100 different species, and Katie felt tears streaming down her face, and she turned to hug Larina, and then the rest of her team, and they all celebrated together. Zareth stood, frozen at his station, and his expression was unreadable, but Katie saw something in his eyes that might have been respect or at least acknowledgement that he had been wrong about her. Later that evening, after the celebrations died down and the crowds dispersed, Katie found herself alone in the garden, where she and Larina had talked after the opening ceremony. She sat on the same bench and looked up at the artificial sky and thought about how far she had come and how much further she still had to go. She heard footsteps and turned to see Zareth approaching, and her body tensed, but he held up his hands in a gesture of peace. He sat down on the other end of the bench and was quiet for a long moment before he said, "I was wrong about you, and I allowed my pride and my species' prejudice to blind me to your abilities, and for that I apologize." Katie looked at him in surprise and said, "Thank you. And that means a lot, and I know I still have so much to learn. Zareth nodded and said we all do. And perhaps that is the real lesson, and I would be honored if you would allow me to join your study group and learn from your unique perspective. Katie smiled and said I would like that, and we could use someone with your knowledge and experience. They sat together and watched the strange plants sway in the breeze, and Katie thought about how the galaxy was full of beings who could become friends.